This evening, we get a chance to hear from the Chief Executive Officer of the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, Mr. Jasper Rugut. 3 years ago, that was in 2016, Kenya was in the news, especially with the international press. And what were they talking about? Kenya not being code compliant as far as the World Anti-Doping Agency was concerned. So a legislation was passed that created the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya. That was in the year 2016. But a short while later, we found out that Kenya really was not code compliant, and that was, again, through the international press. And when every matter was followed up, all that needed to be done were a few amendments so that that law could really be in place. And Kenya was eventually declared code compliant by the World Anti-Doping Agency. That was in June of 2016. And Kenyan athletes effectively participated at the Rio Olympics. That is where this story started for an agency that had actually been created through a legal notice and then came into force through an act of parliament. And Mr. Jasper Rugut, 3 years ago, that's when it all started with all that pressure. You could actually tell us what the journey has been since the law was passed.
Thank you very much. We consider this a proud moment for this country, especially knowing that 3 years ago we had a difficult time even convincing our competitors in the international field that our athletes were competing the way they are supposed to compete. There were a lot of doubts, a lot of aspersions which had been cast on how clean our athletes were. And the government undertook this program seriously. Many things were done within a very short time. A policy was developed in early 2016, and from that policy we drew a bill which later now was enacted into an act of parliament, the Anti-Doping Act number 5 of 2016, which again, as you've mentioned, was later amended in the month of June under number 18 to be the Anti-Doping Act of Kenya as amended by number 18 of 2016. Now, all this and other things now which were happening behind the scenes were really meant just to ensure that when we do compete in international competitions as required under the UNESCO Convention against doping in sports, it would mean that our athletes are tested. It would mean that we have a program, a robust program in place, that we also have education going on, sensitization for the athletes so that they know what it is that they should avoid.
And you've mentioned about testing and also about education. The first task that had to be done was education for the athletes and federation members who were involved in this sport. You could tell us how much education has been done over the last 3 years.
Education is the mainstay of our programs because we really want to ensure that the knowledge against this scourge of doping has reached the stakeholders. And to do this, we have education workshops which are organized, deliberately targeting either athletes themselves or the athlete support personnel, the coaches, the trainers, the managers, even the medical practitioners or the medical support personnel who help these athletes, and officials of the federations themselves. Now, these are targeted workshops, and so far we have had over 120 in the last 3 years, targeting, as I've said, specific categories, that is the stakeholders directly, and we have reached to about 9,500 in that period. Now, 9,500 people, individuals, because we need to record, we need to know who has attended these workshops. We can organize, for example, a workshop for 50 coaches in a certain area, so that when they are in their day-to-day contact with the athletes, they are able to disseminate this information. The medical practitioners or the medical support, who are also a key part of that team, either as physiotherapists, the people who treat normal ailments or injuries that the athletes get into. We organize also so that they are aware of what happens. They are also aware of which substances, which sometimes they prescribe, are prohibited and so on. So these are targeted to specific categories.
Rugut, you've mentioned something, prohibited substances. That comes clear. In Kenya, everyone will talk about EPO. But prohibited methods, which are these specifically that you would be looking at?
Prohibited methods are several. You know, sometimes, for example, you might not use a prohibited substance in terms of a chemical or in terms of a medical substance. But a method, for example, of if somebody draws his blood, you know, and then the body, you know, generates more blood, and then the same blood is injected back into the body. You see, that person now has, you know, a huge, you know, a bigger supply of oxygen through that process, and he might be able now to put an edge, you know, better than his fellow competitors. He has not used any substance, he has not used any drug, and there are many other ways in which performance can be enhanced without necessarily ingesting of a drug or a substance that we understand as prohibited.
I mean, with the exception of the age-old, you know, something that was discovered way back in the 60s, blood doping, as they would call it. Take out your own blood, preserve it, and inject it back. Which other ones tend to be prevalent around here?
Mainly, this is the only known way of doping in this region. Most of what, and this is where we quote the study which was done and released last year, September. Most of what happens in this region is really unsophisticated. We're just talking about use of a certain substance to boost or to enhance performance. And the drugs of choice are known. Where you have more complicated medical attention, and we read about this in Europe 2-3 months ago, where even people were found with, you know, a lot of blood stored, and for that purpose, you know, to be put back into the body. It requires a bit more of sophistication, but in our case, we still have fairly simple, in terms of technology, was the methods require slightly more ingenuity in terms of how it is done.
You mentioned about a report that was released in September, the Kenya report. This was a report that was put together by the World Anti-Doping Agency and the Athletics Integrity Unit, and the report, not the entire report, was made public, but there was what was publicly released, and they simply said this: if you're a top-tier athlete, you probably will be using EPO, but if you're a second-tier athlete, they would be talking about nandrolone. And it just seemed to be that from the out-of-competition testing, and then the nandrolone that was found was in low levels, but in competition testing, it just seemed to show up. And for EPO, almost some balance between out-of-competition testing and in-competition testing. And this was through the intelligence arm of the World Anti-Doping Agency and that of the AIU. How much has changed ever since this report came out last year?
Now, let me clarify one thing. Mainly, what we would call the drug of choice, what substance is used in which particular occasion, is normally determined by which type of sport the person is engaged in. And that is why when we talk about the EPO, mainly that is for what I would call the long distance races. These are the marathons, you know, and middle distance, 10 kilometers going, you know, in that direction, because it boosts the energy of the individual over a long period of time. There are other substances, which steroids, for example, and these are used more by the sprinters, by the people who use, you know, who want to bulk their muscles, the boxers, weightlifters, and so on. So again, just to clarify, sometimes what happens is that the period, the duration in which some of these substances stay in the body, it varies from one drug to another, and that is why sometimes when out of competition, you might get the trace elements in the body of, or in the samples collected from the athlete might not reflect the same levels as if it is taken during competition. Now, this is where intelligence and investigation is important, so that one, you need to know what event is this athlete preparing for. Is it an endurance race, a marathon, for example? And if it is, then which substance is he likely to use using all those information that we have, using again other information which you might get from the laboratory, using information which you might get from the international federation, the event organizers, because there is what we call profiling,
Yes.
where you may need to now know the performance of this particular athlete over a period of time. Has he performed in a steady way, so that during the time when you see between period A and period B, it is normal, he trained well, maybe he took good food, nutrition issues, or is there a spike in that performance?
So, Mr. Rugut, you could tell us how many tests have been carried out by the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya since you came into office?
So far, we have grown our tests. Initially, I have mentioned, when the RAD was doing it, it was about 100. In our first year of inception, we grew that to 500. That was 2016. 2017, we grew up the figure to 850. 2018, we did 1,152 tests. Our target for this year, 2019, is 1,500. So you can see we've continuously progressed our tests. But more important is now, while doing this, we are able to partner with other stakeholders, interested parties, the international federations, who are able to exchange ideas with us and information also about how best to get the people who are cheating. Because even in terms of you can test 1,000, you can test 10,000, but if it is just a test in terms of numbers, it will not help.
So, talking about the risks outside of athletics, which everyone knows is in focus, which are the other sports that tend to look risky for you?
Weightlifting, swimming. We have had cases coming up lately of swimmers. A bit of rugby, we are monitoring it closely. But rugby, because of interactions, we have very many, we participate a lot in international competitions, and we feel, that needs to be monitored because it requires. Then in the ball games, football is coming up as an area of threat. So we have a research department now which undertakes research constantly and updates both our risk analysis and also the risk distribution. So that, the test distribution, so that we are able now not to focus on one area and forget other areas where we have upcoming, propensity towards doping.
Anytime the athletics integrity unit picks up something through the testing system, they always make a provisional announcement. This is something you're under pressure from, to announce a lot of provisional suspensions, because some have actually leaked, and so we would know of them, and actually even reported in the papers and all that. What's the situation here? Because I know it's what the AIU does, other people would want to see it done here, so that the people who are under investigation, whether, until their process is done, people want to know who are these. Or if somebody is missing out for quite some time, people will ask, have they been suspended? Are they injured? Have they retired? Or are they on suspension?
Let me put it this way. The norm would be that we allow the process to develop up to the point that now we can reveal the information. There is an international standard for the protection of individual rights and information. And we feel that if you rush into revealing, some of these cases before you are even given the athlete an opportunity to even respond. As soon as the results come from the laboratory, you need to have the athlete respond. How did it happen? Did he have a TUE? Did he have a therapeutic use exemption certificate to allow him to use that medication? There are several things which you need to know. AIU, I want to admit, has been releasing this information fairly early. So the debate is out there that at what point should we reveal the information. And I think WADA is contemplating the best guide for that, so that information can be revealed as soon as certain things have been confirmed, particularly giving the athlete an opportunity, first of all, to respond. Because if you get the results from the laboratory, and even the athlete is not aware, and the information is in the public domain. Sometimes that is now giving information which really would injure even the reputation of this athlete.
Some of the latest announcements have had to do with the athlete biological passports, and what's interesting is, unlike other tests which have to go through a lot of chemical analysis and everything, this one was actually developed by sports scientists. But in Kenya, people are tending to get scared about the athlete biological passport. What's the knowledge that's being passed about this tool?
The athlete biological passport is simply a way of, through the blood, because this one now can only be done through a blood sample, seeing the pattern, the behavior of certain, because you can take a substance. There are trace elements which will remain in your sample, or there are markers which would remain. That is one. Two, there could be, in terms of the sample of an athlete, there are things which when you analyze, you find there is something which is not normal, and this comes from the laboratory. It has nothing more than that, just to see what is the in terms of the patterns, how does this person's blood be, and it is not attained once. It is something which is studied over time, so that if the sample taken from you last year is markedly different from what was taken from you this year, so what causes the change? You are not sick, you didn't suffer any injury, and so on. So this is what happens, and over a period of time, that is now when we are able to analyze. We have what we call APMU, where this athlete biological monitoring unit, yes, where we give the samples. For now, we have not developed ours here. We have contacted Norway, the Norwegian APMU, to do that for us, because they have all the parameters that they need to analyze. As soon as we give them, particularly the suspicious samples which we feel needs to be studied more, they are able now to use their methods to analyze that and give us a report and say, this is normal, this one you need more monitoring. And particularly for those athletes who are already also under the radar for other reasons, maybe a performance which is not normal, which has shown a spike, maybe somebody who has from nowhere broken a record. We've not heard of him last season. This season he is there and he is breaking a record. So these are all what needs to be monitored. And the importance of this is so that you don't make a conclusion, a prejudiced conclusion about an athlete.
Do you have people who understand that monitoring, the monitoring of the biological passport in the country?
That is why I'm saying at this current moment we are still under training. As soon as we were legislated in 2016, we've had processes which we are going through, and we felt that this one being a very technical area, we could contract it out to the Norwegian APMU so that they can do it for us for the time being. But it will reach a time when we'll need now to do training. We have already sent a team from ADAC, 2 members of our team, to a training in Italy. But that is just the beginning of a process.
We're headed into an Olympic year, so it's a year where I know there's going to be a lot of focus on Kenyan athletes. What are some of the risks that Kenya faces if the federations involved do not get involved in the fight against doping?
I would answer that question this way, that already the international federations in the Olympic sports have already given their requirements. Athletics, for example, has given indications as to what they need. The local federation and the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, for example, now being the only NADO which does this in this country, to be able to do certain things. They have given us, for example, for the World Championships in September in Doha, minimum of 4 tests, 3 of which out of competition, 1 in competition. So these are things that we feel as soon as the communication comes, we work out a plan. We agree with the federation. How are we going to do this?
For example, the IAAF is under the Kenya, Athletics Kenya Kenya as a country is under the radar of the IAAF. How much more work needs to be done so that we just get out of that high-risk group of 4 countries?
I would say this, that, well, the work which is already going on is sufficient, but it needs to be sustained. We need to sustain the testing. We need to sustain the education. We need to sustain, the coverage of those areas of risk, so that going forward, we have less and less cases testing positive. Now, that is the only thing that can remove us from the watch list, the category A, as they call it. Category A simply means that these are the people, or this is the country where it is most likely to find doping going on. And that can only be measured in terms of how much education have we done, how much testing do we do, and how much of those tests, if they're intelligence-based, turn positive. We'll continue to be on the watch list if the positive tests continue coming up. But as soon as we have the assurance that the numbers are coming down and that the tests are still going up, so that even if the numbers are coming down, it's not because we have reduced the testing. We have increased the tests, but the deterrence has occurred so that less and less people get involved in doping. So it's a balance which needs to be done, and it can only be done if across the board everybody takes the issue of doping seriously.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Jasper Rugut. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya. As we head into an Olympic year, and it's a year of Olympic qualification, a lot of focus will be on Kenya, especially when it comes to athletics, considering that also we've got the IAAF World Championships in athletics coming in Doha. What needs to be done to ensure that Kenya gets out of that category A classification as far as cleanliness amongst the athletes is concerned? How many more tests have got to be carried out? And what is it that people need to know? Are people supplying pharmaceuticals that are actually controlled? Are people giving false information? Do doctors realize that every time they treat an athlete, then they need to get in touch with the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya so that that therapeutic use exemption can be given to the athlete? It is a continuing process, but remember, the message always says it's the athlete who's responsible for what they take into their bodies and whatever process they do. And that has been a conversation with the Chief Executive Officer of the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, Mr. Jasper Rugut. I am Daniel Wahome.